Dust doesn't just coat your boots, it works its way into your blood. When the county water table plummeted, folks bet their remaining acreage on heavy steel and diesel pumps. Cindy bought rotting hay. They called her crazy to her face. Then the sky finally broke. 32 days without a drop. Cindy Stone stood at the edge of the irrigation pond, her boots resting on earth that looked like shattered pottery. The mud had curled into hard, grey flakes. In the deepest center of the depression, a single puddle remained, no larger than a kitchen table, thick with green scum and the white, floating bellies of suffocated bluegill. It smelled like pennies and death. Cindy crossed her arms, feeling the abrasive rub of her denim shirt against her sunburned forearms. She was 38, but the last 3 years of drought had carved a decade's worth of lines around her eyes. The Stone farm spanned 300 acres of rolling pasture and row crops, a modest holding that was currently bleeding money. To her left, the corn was stunted, the stalks brittle and yellowed, rustling with a dry, papery sound in the hot wind. Behind her, the crunch of heavy tires signaled Emmett's arrival. Emmett Hayes had worked the neighboring parcel until the bank foreclosed 2 years ago. Now, he leased out his labor to whoever could pay. Lately, Cindy couldn't pay much, but Emmett stayed. He had nowhere else to go, and the silence of his own empty house was too loud. Emmett cut the engine of his rusted F-150 and slammed the door. He walked down the incline, a folded glossy brochure in his calloused hand. He didn't look at the pond. He looked at Cindy. "Got the quote," Emmett said. His voice was gravelly, ruined by years of cheap tobacco and breathing diesel exhaust. Cindy didn't turn. "Read it. 15 grand for the deep well submersible," Emmett recited, flattening the brochure against his thigh. "Another 3 for the PVC piping and the electrical drop. They have to drill down another 150 feet to hit the lower aquifer. The shallow one is tapped out. Everybody and their mother is sucking it dry. $18,000. Cindy closed her eyes. She had $4,000 in the farm's operating account. The credit line was maxed out. The tractor needed a new hydraulic pump, and she owed the feed store a small fortune. "We can't," she said simply. "Cindy, you don't have a choice," Emmett insisted, stepping closer. He pointed a stubby finger at the dead corn, then at the skeletal remains of the pond. "You got 100 head of cattle moving up to the north pasture next week. They need water. The crops need water. You finance the pump. You go to the bank, you put up the South 40 as collateral, and you sign the paper. It's what Will Sullivan did. It's what everyone is doing." "Will Sullivan has corporate backing," Cindy shot back, turning to face him. Her eyes were hard, the color of weak winter sunlight. "If I put up the South 40, the bank owns me. One bad yield, one equipment failure, and they take the land. My grandfather cleared that pasture by hand." "Your grandfather didn't have to deal with 32 days of 90-degree heat in early June," Emmett grunted. "Pride doesn't fill a water trough." Cindy looked past Emmett, up the gentle slope of the land toward the old dairy barn. The barn had caved in on one side during a winter storm 5 years ago. Stacked behind it, exposed to the elements, were 300 large round bales of hay. They were from a bad cut 3 seasons ago, baled too wet, left out to rot. They were completely useless as feed. Moldy, heavy, decomposing. "I'm not buying the pump," Cindy said. Emmett let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Right. Okay. You going to do a rain dance? Maybe hire a dowser with a willow stick?" Cindy started walking up the incline, her boots kicking up puffs of chalky dust. "No. I'm going to use the hay." Emmett caught up to her, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "The hay? Cindy, that stuff is garbage. It's black inside. It's growing mushrooms." "Exactly," she said, her pace quickening. The idea was forming. knitting itself together from half-remembered conversations with an old agronomist she'd met in her 20s, from books she'd read on regenerative soil, from watching the way water used to move across this land before they tile-drained it to death. When it does rain, Emmett, what happens? Tell me. It washes out, Emmett said, humoring her. The ground is baked hard. Water hits it, runs straight down the gullies, washes the topsoil into the county ditch, and disappears. It runs off because there's nothing to slow it down, Cindy said, stopping at the crest of the hill. She pointed down at the landscape. The natural topography formed a shallow, wide valley that funneled into the pond. We've spent 50 years trying to get water off this land as fast as possible to plant earlier. Now we need to hold it. If we drill deeper, we're just stealing water from tomorrow to survive today. When the lower aquifer dries up, then what? We pack up and move to a city. She turned to him, the intensity in her gaze forcing Emmett to take a half-step back. I'm going to place those rotting bales in the swales, Cindy declared, her voice dropping to a low, steady timbre. I'm going to build check dams along the contour lines of the entire watershed leading down to the pond. We pack the dirt. We lay the hay. We create a sponge. Emmett stared at her for a long, silent moment. A hawk circled overhead, letting out a sharp, lonely cry. You're out of your damn mind, Emmett said quietly. A sponge? Cindy, you're talking about landscaping with garbage. It's not going to hold water. It's going to wash away, and you're going to lose the herd. It will hold, Cindy said, though her stomach twisted with sudden, cold terror. It has to. I ain't helping you ruin yourself, Emmett said, turning back toward his truck. Call the bank, Cindy. He drove off, leaving a plume of dust that lingered in the stagnant air long after the sound of his engine faded. Cindy stood alone, looking at the rotting hay. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the gamble she was about to take. She didn't have $18,000. She had a failing farm, a stubborn streak, and 300 bales of mold. She walked to the equipment shed and climbed into the cab of the skid steer. It started on the third crank, belching a cloud of black smoke. It was time to go to work. Word travels faster than fire in a dry county. By Tuesday, Cindy's operation was the primary topic of conversation at Stone's Feed and Seed. She had spent the last 3 days hauling the massive, rotting round bales with the skid steer, crawling back and forth across the blistered pastures like a persistent, solitary beetle. When she walked into the feed store on Wednesday morning to buy thick baling twine and a few replacement teeth for the loader bucket, the low hum of chatter instantly died. Will Sullivan was standing at the counter. Wills ran 2,000 acres of soy and corn on the east side of the highway. He drove a King Ranch pickup that had never seen a muddy road, and his boots were polished leather. He wasn't a bad man. He paid his taxes, sponsored the local Little League team, and tipped well. But he was a businessman who viewed dirt as a factory floor. He had zero patience for sentimentality. Cindy, Wills said, tipping the brim of his cap. He had a receipt in his hand for a pallet of synthetic nitrogen. Heard you're doing some alternative landscaping out at your place. Cindy dropped 3 spools of heavy twine onto the counter. She didn't smile. Just moving some old feed, Wills? Emmett says you refuse the deep well, Wills continued, his voice loud enough for the 4 other farmers loitering near the coffee pots to hear. Says you're plugging up the dry wash with spoiled alfalfa. Cindy pulled her worn leather wallet from her back pocket. She didn't look at Emmett, who was sitting in the corner, staring intently into his black coffee. He had told them. Of course he had. It wasn't out of malice. It was out of disbelief. He was crowdsourcing validation for his exit. Emmett talks too much, Cindy said, handing two $20 bills to the clerk. "Look, Cindy," Wills said, stepping closer, adopting a tone of aggravating paternal concern. "I know things are tight. The bank is squeezing everyone. But you can't mulch a drought. You're building beaver dams in a desert. If you need a loan to float the pump, I can front you the cash. Take a lien on the north pasture." "I don't want your money, Wills," Cindy said, taking her change. "And I don't want the bank's." "It's physics, Cindy," Wills chuckled, looking back at the men by the coffee pot. A few of them smirked. "Water flows downhill. When the rain comes, if it ever comes, it's going to blow right through that rotten hay and leave you with a mess of wet garbage clogging your spillway. You need volume. You need a pump." "A pump just pulls water from somewhere else," Cindy said, finally turning to face him fully. Her shoulders were tight, her muscles screaming from 3 days of violent bouncing in the skid steer. "What happens when your deep well runs dry, Wills? You going to drill to China?" Wills's smile faded. "I'm operating in reality, Cindy. You're operating in a fairy tale. I'm just trying to help before you lose your grandfather's place over a stubborn refusal to join the 21st century." Cindy picked up her twine. "See you around, Wills." She walked out, the bell on the door ringing sharply behind her. As soon as the door clicked shut, the laughter started. It was low at first, then louder. A cynical, dismissive sound that carried through the thin glass windows. Cindy paused on the gravel, her grip tightening on the twine until the plastic cut into her calluses. She swallowed the lump of humiliation rising in her throat. She got into her truck and drove back to the silence of her farm. When she pulled up to the barn, Emmett's rusted F-150 was parked by the skid steer. Emmett was leaning against the bucket, holding a pair of heavy leather work gloves. He looked up as Cindy stepped out of her truck. "You told them," she said, her voice flat. "I told them you were being an idiot," Emmett replied, not breaking eye contact. "Because you are." "Then why are you here?" Emmett sighed, a long, ragged exhalation that seemed to deflate him. He kicked at the dry earth. "Because I drove past your lower 40 on the way home yesterday. You set the Bales wrong on the east grade. The contour line dips there. If you don't key the Bales into the banks, the water will just channel around the edges and scour out the topsoil." Cindy stared at him. "You know how to build a check dam?" "I built them with the Forestry Service back in the 90s when I lived out west," Emmett grumbled, pulling his gloves on. "Used rocks and logs mostly. But hay might work if we pack it tight enough and stake it down. But it's going to be a miserable, filthy job. And I ain't doing it for free. You owe me back pay when you sell the fall calves." "Deal," Cindy said, a fraction of the tension leaving her chest. They worked for 10 days. It was a punishing, brutal routine. The skid steer could only move the bales to the edge of the ravines. From there, Cindy and Emmett had to break the massive rounds apart by hand, dragging heavy, suffocating flakes of mold-choked alfalfa down into the dry washers. The dust coated their lungs. The rotting hay smelled like fermented acid, stinging their noses and making their eyes water. They dug shallow trenches across the dry creek beds, laying the hay in thick, overlapping mats. They drove wooden stakes through the bales deep into the hard clay to anchor them. Every evening, Cindy scrubbed the black dirt from her skin until she was raw, but she could still smell the decay. They built over 40 check dams. They arranged the bales in smiling arcs across the shallow slopes, designed to catch runoff, slow it down, and force it to spread sideways across the pasture rather than racing straight to the bottom. By the end of the second week, the farm looked insane. From the county road, it appeared as though Cindy had dumped hundreds of massive, fuzzy black caterpillars in perfectly spaced lines across her property. Cars would slow down as they drove past. Cindy knew they were taking pictures. She knew what they were saying in town. The heat broke her mind. On a suffocating Thursday afternoon, they placed the final bale at the mouth of the main inlet feeding the pond. Emmett collapsed onto the dusty bank, wiping his face with a filthy rag. "That's it," Emmett rasped, looking up at the sky. It was a vicious, unyielding blue. Not a cloud in sight. The sun beat down like a hammer. "We're done. We built the sponge." Cindy sat down next to him. Her body ached in places she didn't know existed. She looked at the ugly, ragged lines of rotting hay scarring her grandfather's pristine pasture. She looked at the dry, empty pond. "Now what?" Emmett asked, tossing a pebble into the dust. Cindy leaned her head back, closing her eyes against the glare. "Now, we wait." They waited for 9 days. 9 days of relentless, suffocating heat that baked the ground until it cracked deep enough to swallow a wrench. The 100 head of cattle arrived from the North Lease on a Tuesday, stepping off the trailers with their ribs showing, lowing in confusion at the barren pastures. Cindy had to buy a plastic poly tank and strap it to the flatbed. She and Emmett spent 4 hours every morning hauling municipal water from town, paying a premium per gallon just to fill the troughs. It was a hemorrhaging of cash that Cindy couldn't sustain for another week. Will Sullivan drove by twice. He didn't stop. He just slowed his pristine King Ranch truck down to a crawl, looking at the black, mouldy bales littering the swales, shaking his head before accelerating away. Cindy stopped going into town. She stopped checking the mail. The balance on her ledger wasn't a number anymore. It was a physical weight pressing against her ribs. Every time she looked at the hay dams, doubt gnawed at her. They looked absurd. Piles of garbage baking in the sun. She had staked her grandfather's legacy on decomposing alfalfa. Then came the afternoon of August the 12th. It didn't begin with clouds. It began with the wind dying completely. The air grew thick, heavy, and still. The cicadas, which had been screaming in the tree lines for a month, suddenly went dead silent. Cindy was fixing a broken gate latch down by the lower pens when she felt it. A sudden, sharp drop in the barometric pressure that made her ears pop. She stood up, dropping her wrench. The cattle were already grouped tightly in the corner of the pasture, their heads turned toward the northwest. Over the tree line, the sky had turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple. It wasn't a normal storm front. It looked solid, a wall of churning violence pushing across the plains. A cold downdraft hit the farm, kicking up a massive wall of loose topsoil. Emmett's truck came tearing down the dirt lane, laying on the horn. He skidded to a halt near the gate, throwing the passenger door open. "Get in!" he yelled over the rising wind. "Tornado sirens are going off in the county." Cindy scrambled into the cab just as the first drops hit the windshield. They weren't raindrops. They were massive, heavy globes of water that struck the glass like buckshot. "The cattle?" Cindy asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "They're hunkered down in the tree break," Emmett said, wrestling the truck into gear. "Nothing we can do for them now. We need to get up to the house." Before he could hit the gas, the sky split open. It wasn't rain, it was a localized deluge, a micro-burst of staggering volume. The drought-hardened earth couldn't absorb a drop of it. Within seconds, the water sheeted across the baked clay, gathering speed, turning the gentle slopes of the stone farm into a sprawling, muddy river. "Drive to the ridge," Cindy ordered, grabbing the dashboard. "Take the ridge path above the main wash." "Cindy, we need to get inside." "Drive to the ridge," she screamed. Emmett swore loudly, spinning the wheel and slamming the accelerator. The truck fishtailed in the sudden mud, tires screaming for traction before biting into the underlying hardpan. They clawed their way up the incline, stopping just below the tree line, overlooking the valley that funneled down to the dry pond. Through the frantic beating of the windshield wipers, they watched the onslaught, A wall of brown, churning water was rushing down the main wash. It carried dead branches, loose rocks, and decades of precious topsoil. It was moving fast, gaining momentum, a violent force of nature that was about to gut the pasture and scour the valley down to the bedrock. "It's going to blow right through them," Emmett whispered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The flash flood hit the first check dam. It was a massive structure, 5 round bales wide, keyed into the banks and pinned with oak stakes. The brown wave slammed into the rotten hay with a heavy concussive thud. Cindy stopped breathing. The water rose instantly, backing up against the hay. The stakes groaned. The bales shifted, lifting slightly under the immense pressure. Muddy water boiled around the edges. "Hold," Cindy muttered, her fingernails biting into her palms. "Please, hold." The water crested the top of the bales, but it didn't break them. The sheer mass of the waterlogged, decaying hay held its ground. Instead of blowing out, the water spilled over the top in a slow, controlled sheet. More importantly, the hay acted like a giant sieve. The heavy silt, the rocks, and the tearing force of the flood were caught behind the dam. The water that spilled over the top had lost its destructive velocity. It flowed down to the next swale, slower this time. It hit the second line of bales. It backed up, spread out laterally across the dry pasture, and seeped into the deep cracks in the clay. "Look," Emmett said, pointing a trembling finger at the passenger window. Cindy looked. The water wasn't just running down the gully anymore. The check dams were forcing the flood to walk, not run. The runoff was backing up into shallow, temporary pools behind every single bale, spreading 50 feet wide across the flat plains. The ground, finally given a chance to drink, began to bubble as trapped air escaped the soil. For 2 hours the storm raged. The lightning was a constant, blinding strobe. Cindy and Emmett sat in the truck with the engine idling, the heater blasting to fight the sudden chill, watching the rotting hay absorb the fury of the sky. Not a single bale broke. By the time the rain finally slacked into a steady grey drizzle, the landscape had entirely transformed. The angry, scouring rivers were gone. In their place, a terraced network of still, dark pools reflected the fading stormlight. The farm had swallowed the flood. Morning broke with a fierce, clean light. The air smelled of crushed roots, wet sage, and deep, saturated earth. Will Sullivan was furious. He had spent the night watching the storm wash thousands of dollars of synthetic fertilizer off his east fields. The soil had been baked too hard. The rain hit, grabbed the top layer, and took it straight into the county drainage ditches. To make matters worse, a lightning strike had fried the transformer, feeding his new deep well submersible pump. He had a mud pit for a farm, and no way to water his herd until the electric company came out. He climbed into his truck, tires spinning in the slick mud of his driveway, and headed toward the highway. He needed to check the property lines. As he neared the stone place, a grim sense of vindication settled in his chest. He knew what flash floods did to dry washes. Cindy's little science experiment would be gone, her topsoil washed into the road, her fences blown out by the debris. He slowed down as he approached her property line, expecting to see a disaster. He pulled over to the shoulder and killed the engine. There was no debris on the road. The fences were standing perfectly straight. Wills got out of his truck, his expensive boots sinking instantly into the soft, yielding grass. He walked to the barbed wire and stared. The hay bales were still there. They looked different now. They were flattened, heavy, and black as pitch, looking like massive, dormant beasts resting in the swales. Behind every single line of bales, the ground was dark and saturated. The deep, jagged cracks in the clay had swollen shut. The pasture wasn't a muddy disaster zone. It was a sponge, holding millions of gallons of water within the soil profile. Wills followed the contour of the land down toward the bottom of the valley. Cindy and Emmett were standing by the edge of the pond. Wills unlatched the gate and walked down the hill. His boots didn't slip. The ground gripped them, firm but deeply hydrated. As he got closer, he heard a sound he hadn't heard on this side of the county in 3 years. Frogs. Dozens of them, croaking from the damp edges of the pasture. He reached the edge of the depression. The pond wasn't just full, it was overflowing its banks, pushing back into the cattails, and the water wasn't the thick, brown slurry of flash flood runoff. It was slightly tea-colored from the hay tannins, but it was clear. The Bales had filtered out the silt. The topsoil had stayed on the farm. Cindy turned as Wills approached. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her boots were caked in mud. But her posture was entirely different. The defensive tension that had carried her through the last month was gone. She stood tall, her thumbs hooked into her front pockets. Emmett was leaning on a shovel, a small, arrogant smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He didn't bother hiding it. Wills stopped a few feet away. He looked at the full pond, then traced the terraced lines of wet, decomposing hay back up the hill. He saw the cattle in the north pasture, heads down, grazing on grass that was already beginning to green at the roots. He thought about his scoured fields. He thought about his broken, $18,000 pump. "The county ditch is running dry past your property," Wills said finally, his voice lacking its usual booming authority. "Normally it's flooded over the blacktop by now." "Water didn't make it to the ditch," Cindy said quietly. "We kept it." Wills nodded slowly. He took off his cap and ran a hand through his thinning hair. He was a proud man, a man who measured success in steel, diesel, and yield monitors. Acknowledging that he was wrong felt like swallowing glass, but he was also a farmer, and he couldn't deny the dirt in front of him. "It held," Wills said. It wasn't a question. "Like a sponge," Emmett chimed in, leaning heavier on his shovel. Wills ignored Emmett and looked directly at Cindy. "The lower aquifer is dropping. County Water Board sent out an email this morning. Everyone who pumped through July is going to get hit with usage fines. I blew a transformer last night. My herd is dry." Cindy didn't gloat. She looked at the man who had laughed at her in front of half the town, who had told her she was losing her mind. She looked at the vast, shimmering surface of her pond. "Gates open, Wills," Cindy said softly. "You can run a poly pipe from the east bank to your troughs. Won't charge you a dime. But you have to lay the line yourself. We're busy." Wills swallowed hard. He looked at the water, then back at her. "I appreciate that, Cindy." He turned and walked back up the hill, his shoulders a little heavier, his polished boots covered in the rich, wet dirt of the stone farm. Emmett let out a low whistle. "Never thought I'd see the day Wills Sullivan looked like a whipped dog. You should have charged him $20 a gallon." "We're not him," Cindy said. She walked to the edge of the water and crouched down. She reached out, plunging her bare hand into the cool, clear water. She scooped up a handful of the wet, black earth from the bank. It held together perfectly, rich and heavy, smelling of life and survival. They hadn't just saved the herd. They had healed the land. And as the morning sun warmed the soaked fields, steam began to rise from the rotting hay, a quiet, breathing testament to the woman who chose dirt over steel. Sometimes the oldest, dirtiest methods are the only ones that truly heal the land. Cindy didn't need a corporate budget to save her farm. She just needed to understand the earth beneath her boots. If you were inspired by Cindy's grit and this story of fighting the odds, hit that like button. Share this with someone who appreciates real hard work, and subscribe to our channel for more deeply human stories from the heartland.